Good morning, everybody. I'm Nathan Moody. Thank you for joining me at AirCon to talk about the most exciting thing we possibly could be covering, which is accounting. Um, Hopefully, this will not be a painful talk. We're going to be um, talking about how to price audio services. This talk is intended to be primarily aimed at sound designers, primarily in the game industry, primarily freelancers. But this is going to cover a whole bunch of topics that is applicable to literally any creative discipline, whether you're in house or a freelancer, and certainly will provide a whole bunch of um, different ideas and a framework that you can take away um, to start thinking about this stuff in a perhaps a more logical way, in a way that's more predictable. So what we're going to do is get started here. There's a lot of material to cover on a topic like this, as you might imagine. So what I'd like to do is try to stay focused for 35, 40 minutes or so, and then what I'd love to do is take questions at the end. So if you have thoughts or questions or you need clarifications, please write them down. But I'm going to be referring to the chat after the presentation is done, just so I can uh, maximize mental and cognitive bandwidth. So great to see so many folks that I've never met before here and to see a lot of familiar faces. Really excited to share all of this with you. So let's get into audio services pricing. So what I'm going to present today is a set of principles and a framework for arriving at a project price. Again, as I said at the top, it's going to be game audio centric, but it's applicable to almost any audio project. Heck, it's applicable to almost any creative project of any type, which is why I have found this framework to be really useful. And of course, even if you are freelance, and this will be useful if you're in-house and you need to come up with internal budgets, there's going to be a lot of takeaways here for you as well, I hope. So what this is not going to be about is a deep dive on estimating hours needed. So that might cause you to scratch your head for a second. It's like, wait a minute, how do I price a job if I don't know how long it'll take me? Well, we'll get into estimates in a little bit, but estimates are very personal. And one of the goals of this talk is to make sure that we actually don't even talk about actual dollar amounts, because everyone's circumstances are so different based on what market they're in and based on what part of the industry they're in. So I'm going to present a framework that is actual money amount free. And we'll talk a little bit about estimations, but that's a whole topic unto itself. So we'll get more into that in a little bit. And we're not going to get today into contractual language or negotiations. We'll talk on negotiating a little bit when it comes to project pricing, but there's just only so much time. And basically what we're talking about is business development and finance in the creative world, and there's only so much time for that. So here's the framework we're going to talk about today. Cost times scope times risk times alignment equals price. So we're going to be seeing this formula a lot throughout the next hour. And this framework came about as a result of my 3 decades in the creative services industry. I've had many mentors in studio leadership and business development that's helped me understand the value of a framework like this. I have been a studio co-founder and department head myself, and so I've used this for at least 15 years on every project I've done, whether it's in the service of another agency or studio or as a freelancer, which I am now. And I've had a lot of success with this model across lots of different careers and disciplines. Which ones are many? This is every single job I've actually used to pay rent or mortgage in my career. The last 4 are really the ones that are pursuant today, but this is interesting just because it shows that all of these industries that I've worked in have all benefited from using this framework. Now, in terms of being an audio professional, I've had the great privilege to work with studios like are listed here, as well as on my own as a noise jockey for sound design and Obsidian Sound for mastering. Recently, I've worked on games such as the Callisto Protocol, Pentiment, the Blackout Club, and more coming very soon. And I've mastered over 500 albums and singles as a mastering engineer, including my current focus, which is mastering game soundtracks, which I've done for Bethesda, ArenaNet, Cyan, Devoured Studios, Netflix, and more. So that is just context for who I am and how I've come to experience this kind of framework. So we're going to start by talking about the difference between cost and price. So what is the difference? Cost is what you need to earn a living working for a certain amount of time. Price is the meeting point where what you want to be paid meets what the client is willing to pay. So let's talk about how you figure out cost. So the most important thing with cost when you're coming up with your estimates is to pick a time scale. Are you going to bill by the hour, the half day, the day, or the week? There's lots of ways to do this. There's lots of typical standards for how this is done, but they vary based on industry, based on what geographical market you're in. And so the best way to figure out what the right time scale for you is to talk to other media professionals in your market, in your industry vertical, and see how they're doing it. The next thing to consider is basically your overhead per month, and then divide that by your time scale. So hopefully this will not be too much math. This might be the most math we do all morning, hopefully. But let's just say that your overhead, which is everything, it's rent, food, repair fund for equipment that might break, fund money, money, this is really important for savings and reinvestment in your own business. That is all your overhead. So if your overhead is $5,000 a month and you work an average of 20 working days in a month, then your cost of doing business is $250 a day. I'm sorry, I'm doing it in dollars. The dollar amounts don't matter. But this is how you calculate your cost. So if you're going to do 20 days of work, that's $250 per day of work. That'll be around $5,000 at the end of the month. But as I said before, it's really important to factor into your cost what you need to put away for saving, retirement, reinvestment, repairs, veterinary bills, college funds. That is all your overhead. It's not just rent and electricity bills and utility bills. Really, really important to always factor that in. So that's your cost, but it's not always as simple as this formula of overhead per month divided by time scale. There are other factors to consider as well. This is totally unique per person. Where do you live? Do you own? Do you rent? Do you have kids? Do you have pets? How early are you in your career? How advanced are you in your career? So I think what I really want to underscore is that cost is really personal, and it is something that is utterly unique per individual. But it also changes and evolves constantly because we all go through life changes. So your cost has to always be refactored, looked at anew every quarter or every year. And that is a good way to make sure that all of a sudden something in your life starts to change and your cost isn't keeping up with that life change. The harsh reality is that while this is unique per person, it also has to be compared to others in your market. Your cost might seem incredibly high if you live in the city of San Francisco, but it's going to be high for everyone else who also lives in San Francisco. And that's really hard to compare to someone who might live in the hinterlands of Scotland in our global economy, or who might live in Slovenia. So your cost is something that you always have to establish and figure out and then compare to others in your market. We already talked about this, but I put it again here because it's so important. Your cost has to include a baseline profit and savings margin so that you're not just covering the cost of just subsistence living. So another thing to remember is that you will never be billable 100% of the available time you have to work. And why is that? You have emails, you have business development, you have calls with potential clients, you have to go get groceries, you have to take your animals to the vet, whatever it might be. You're never billable 100% of the time. So you need to figure out what your billability is going to be. So let's go back to our previous example. If your overhead is $5,000 a month, and you are available to work 20 work days in a month, it's a pretty good percentage to start with is maybe you're only going to be 75% billable because of all those factors we just talked about. So that means now all of a sudden your cost will go up because you're only working 15 billable days instead of 20 billable days in a month. So then your daily cost goes from $250 to over $300 just by factoring in your billability. Or this is also known as your billable allocation. This is also a really good example of why it actually pays in the long term to hire people to help you, like lawyers and accountants. If you're doing your own books, if you're looking at your own contracts, you cannot bill that time. And so over time, you might find that that's a really good avenue for making those decisions about, you know what, I should hire a bookkeeper. I should retain a lawyer to look at contracts, stuff like that. So your cost is not negotiable, but you can control it somewhat. Going through a cost exercise is a good way to kind of look at the lifestyle that you're leading and making sure you are really living within your means. If you find that there's a big difference between the kind of work you want to do and what your cost is, you might have to decide that maybe that's not a viable target, or you might want to decide to move somewhere less expensive. It opens up a lot of these kind of difficult but important decisions that you might have to make. So if you think of it this way, cost times scope should equal price, right? You know how much it costs you to work for a certain amount of time. A scope will determine how much time you're going to be working. That should be your price. Well, not quite, because of that equation we looked at a few slides back, which we'll come to shortly. I do want to take a short sidebar and talk about value-based pricing. Most pricing models are based on effort spent. So they're effort-based or labor-bound pricing models. Value-based pricing is more about the value of the services that you're providing than time. And the best example I can think of and have come across and have done myself is sonic branding, where it is going to be a highly iterative, very more design process than an artistic process. But you're creating an audio logo for a client, and that the value of that is just insane compared to like creating footsteps in a game. And that's not to say that Foley and footsteps are not valuable. Of course they're valuable. But when you look at strategic value to your client, this is where things like audio branding, the value is much higher. So it's important to consider also, if you're senior or a veteran or you just work fast, is it fair for you to be paid less because you're fast and you're good and you're really seasoned? This is something that you should figure out how to compensate for, which we'll talk about just in a second. It's also hard to estimate against without a lot of experience. So if you're slow and your estimates may not be accurate, should you be paid more? That doesn't make sense either. So to simplify how you think about value provided, I have two pieces of advice. Number one, just change your cost. So if you're a veteran, if you're really experienced, you're getting further on in your career, your cost basis should be higher. And that may not mean that you're living higher on the hog and that you're driving Ferraris. It might mean that you're putting a lot more money away into reinvestment to upgrade your equipment, or putting more money in for your kids' college or university funds, whatever that may be. And then the other way to think about value is that it's a factor of alignment, project alignment. And we're going to be talking so much about alignment in a little while. We're going to put a pin in that and come back to it. So this is where we come back to cost times scope, which you just kind of talked about, times risk times alignment equals price. So one thing to call out here is that cost is your decision, and it is largely, if not entirely, in your control. Scope, and I'm subsuming schedule inside of scope as well, that is something that the client is bringing to the table with a proposal for the work that they need done. Those first two things are pretty objective most of the time. Risk and alignment are incredibly and entirely subjective. So we'll get to that in just a moment. We're going to spend a lot of time on risk and on alignment. So you can see that this basically is like a matrix between your needs and as your needs as vendor and the client's needs. So let's break down how these needs break out across the client vendor lines. So what does a client need in any project? There's scope, there's schedule, and there's rights. Scope is how much you're being asked to do. The schedule is by when that scope must be finished. And then rights is how many rights to your work does the client retain. Your concerns, besides covering your costs, are risk and alignment. Risk are things that could increase time or scope or the effort needed. And alignment is a price modifier based on how well the project fits for you. And that's not just, I'm a Foley artist, it's a Foley project. It's, I'm a Foley artist, it's a Foley project. I'm incredibly busy right now, but this is the kind of project I've always wanted to work on for the last 20 years. Those factors are alignment. And I think a lot of people tend to look at risk and alignment in a very intuitive, less formal way. And today I want to talk about how to do this in a really formal way that actually can give you negotiation levers when you do talk about price, and can help you better understand how to apply monetary amounts to express how well something fits for you as a project. So we're going to go real quick through scope, schedule, and rights. These are just things to think about. Scope first. Really, I'm a huge proponent, as I think most in this industry are, about working backwards from effort needed, not asset counts. Because footstep sweeteners as assets are very, very different in terms of time it takes to create compared to an entire set of creature vocalizations that are capable of conveying complex emotion. You just can't compare the two. So really focus on overall effort, not asset counts, when you do come up with your estimates. Always factor in revision cycles. One of the things that I do on every project that I'm on is I use my own time trackers just in a spreadsheet. And that allows me to then look back historically over years. And I found that, hey, you know what? 9 times out of 10, if the initial getting to a round one presentation takes N amount of time, my revision after that almost always takes half N. And then the third revision takes quarter N. It almost always goes that way. And so that's how I can actually pretty accurately estimate how much time it'll take me to go through a certain number of revision rounds. So factor that into the scope as well. Really important, we're not going to talk about contractual language, but it's really important to list out and give back to the client every assumption that you're making about what is included. So document every scope inclusion you can possibly think of, even if it wasn't given to you by the client. Equally important is you should document every exclusion, everything that's not included. And this is where you can really defend yourself against scope creep and other issues, because you can put this in your statement of work or your contractor agreement or whatever paperwork you have with your client. Because it's surprising how often a client will be like, well, you're doing this, aren't you also going to do this? It's like, no, that's maybe completely different in your mind, but it's not made clear to the client. And inclusions and exclusions are important because you share those back with the client, make sure everyone agrees. And if people don't agree, that's okay. Just the scope goes up or the scope goes down. So schedule, of course, is usually non-negotiable. This is something usually determined by the client in most cases. But it's really important to also, because we're all in audio, coming last in the chain most of the time, to get agreement with the client about handling someone else's or another department's missed milestones, and making sure there's an understanding of if there isn't day for day or week for week or month for month slip, then that is going to impact how much scope you can deliver in that time. So just have those conversations early and often. And then when they say, oh, we're going to need this stuff by beta, we're going to need this stuff by alpha, make sure everyone agrees on what those words actually means. The longer I'm in this industry, the more I realize there isn't a whole lot less consensus around what those terms mean in terms of how different software studios and game studios define alpha and beta and stuff like that. So rights, this is going to be short and sweet for sound designers. Usually you retain no rights to your work. It's all work for hire and the client owns it, and that should be fine. The only exception I've run across is if you're asked to just basically do sound library or palette creation. It could be more nuanced. If you provide a price that's deemed too high, or the client kind of winces a little bit and says, oh, that's kind of expensive, you could perhaps negotiate exclusivity for a certain amount of time. So I'm going to create a library or a palette of sounds for you that you can use in your game with complete worldwide exclusivity for 3 years, 5 years. And then the rights revert back to me. And then I could sell a sound library of this on my own later. And then you have no rights to that at that point, and I can get more revenue at that point, so my price can come down. So something to consider. There's no time in this talk to talk about how nuanced this issue is with music, but the more rights you retain, the more price levers can be pushed and pulled. This is a whole topic worthy of another speaker at AirCon or somewhere else. But for music, it's always one of the main things that gets negotiated. So now we're on to the big remaining two items, risk and alignment. So let's take a quick water break. So risk and alignment, what the heck are these things? So risk is always a price multiplier. These are things that could balloon a project in scope or effort needed. And it's important to quantify every risk item and give it an actual numeric multiplier. We'll get into reasons why that's so important in just a little bit. Alignment is either a multiplier or a divisor. A divisor meaning it's a discount, depending on how well or poorly a project is aligned. So these are tools to express value to both the client and ourselves. So let's get into risk for a little bit. We'll talk about how this breaks down. Risk elements should be a list of what could blow up your estimates of effort. It can provide a buffer against the inevitability of not estimating correctly, because sometimes we get it more right, sometimes we get it less right, but none of us ever will be perfect with estimates. And it's important to remember that, and risk is a way to recoup some potential oversights on our part. But it's important to think of risk not as just, we're going to pad the estimates to make more money. That's not what this is about at all. It is about logically figuring out what are the risks on this project that might invalidate some of our assumptions or our estimates, and recapture that cost in case those things wind up being true. And as I've kind of intimated already, these need to be identified and described accurately and specifically, because you may have reason to share this with your client. And this is where these risk elements also become negotiation points. Every risk factor that you list should be expressed as a percentage increase to price based on how risky that factor actually seems. So so in my experience, a risk factor might increase the price by as little as 2%. or as much as 15%. But 15% is an extremely risky risk factor. So I tend to use percentages in that range. But again, everyone's risk tolerance is super different. And this is where it becomes really important. If a client can identify one of your risks, or you can tell the client about one of these risk items that you think is kind of critical, and they can provide a means to mitigate that risk, great. If you can talk about that and get them to agree to take action to reduce one of those risk factors, your price can come down. Everybody's happy. But everyone's risk tolerance is different. And this is why risk is really subjective. What might be a 15% risk to me might be a 3% risk to somebody else. And there is no right or wrong here. And that's why I'm not sharing my risk spreadsheet with you, because it is really subjective. So let's talk about some very concrete risk examples that I've identified on projects that I've worked on, and that seem to recur over and over again on projects of all types. Is there a single creative vision holder who confidently knows what a successful outcome will look or sound like? And what is your access to that person? If it seems like no one's leading the ship in terms of just being the vision holder, that's a risk, because then it could turn into a bring me a rock game where someone says, bring me a rock. You just bring them a rock and say, no, 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 not that rock. And if the client has very ill-formed ideas about what it is that they want in terms of a successful outcome, that means more churn, more revision, greater risk that your effort will be higher. Is there a design brief at all? And if so, how well is it articulated? Is there a dedicated producer on the client side to the audio discipline as a whole? What's the experience level of the team on this project? Are they seasoned and they've shipped 20 games? Are they brand new? It's a team of 3 and they've never released a game before. That range carries different amounts of risk. Is there a decision by committee structure that you might have to contend with? That might, rather than having a single point of contact, you get a shotgun blast in the face of conflicting feedback, and you have to figure out how to parse that, how to navigate those personalities who are giving all that feedback. This is where your work can turn very quickly from sound design into client therapy, which has value. Trust me, I know. But that's a different kind of project, and it involves a lot more hand-holding and negotiation with your client. Is there any sort of reputational risk in working with this client or on this sort of content? I'm not going to get into that anymore, because you can see how subjective, deeply, deeply subjective that kind of question is. Is there a publisher involved in addition to the studio in the approvals process? How far is this going to have to go up the chain in order to get final approval? That could lead to mystery stakeholders at the 11th hour, late-breaking revisions, stuff like that. Does the end product involve a brand new piece of technology? Boy, have I been burned by this one. New pieces of tech, version 1.0s of anything, being a launch title for a brand new platform, all of that carries a huge amount of technical risk. And that may require some asset churn or implementation churn that you may not have if you're coming onto a project that's being delivered on a midlife or even near end of life or late stage existing platform. Does your work get implemented by somebody else? Or are you just creating content? Who is that person? How much about implementation do they know? This could perhaps blow back and wind up having you being asked to increase your scope. That can be done through leveraging a change order if that's deemed out of scope when you sign your contract. But that's something to always ask about. Is any of my work entirely dependent on stakeholders or colleagues that I'm going to have difficulty reaching or coordinating with? And one of the keys there for me is actually time zone. So I've worked with clients literally all over the world, and there may be people who are ready to speak with me during the business day, no problem, but there might be exactly 1 hour of overlap between my business day and theirs. That adds risk, because then you're looking at a communication lag, which can delay delivery of feedback and potentially delay delivery of actual work product as well. And here's another really tricky one. What is your rapport basically with the primary point of contact? Do they seem easy or hard to communicate with? That can absolutely be a risk factor. And that's one that's going to be really hard to negotiate, because the primary point of contact, that's someone that usually cannot be reassigned to any other sort of role. So that's just something you'll have to think about. And again, how many time zones away is the main team? It seems like a weird one to be a risk, but over time, I've just seen effort directly increase as a result of how far away the client is in time zone from where the vendor is. So that's something to also consider. And that is obviously not a 15% risk factor. That might be a 1 or 2% risk factor, but it's something to consider. So enough about risk. Again, apologies, there's a lot to cover. If you've got questions, we'll circle back to them in about 10 minutes. But now we're going to talk about alignment, which is different from risk, but it is a price variable that still applies, just like risk does. Alignment, however, is all about you and your immediate circumstances. Again, completely and utterly subjective. And a project can be well aligned or poorly aligned as a whole. And what we're about to talk about is how to look at a project and its alignment factors and quantify that. So well aligned usually means you can offer a discount, and poorly aligned usually means you're going to pad it for risk. Document and accurately describe every single alignment aspect, just like you did with risk. And again, apply those percentage-based price modifiers. Just gave that one away. One of the nice things about alignment, and this is one of the kind of secret sauces of this presentation, I think, is that alignment is how you can decide whether or not to work for free. I do not have a binary you should or shouldn't decision here. I feel very strongly that it's alignment that determines whether or not you effectively give a 100% discount due to alignment, which means the project will not have a cost for the client. So think about, should I work for free or not? Think about it in terms of alignment and just a percentage modifier to your cost, which might be as high as minus 100%. Extra super surprise, this is also how you can even decide to take the project or not. And so working out alignment first, before risk, before scope, before cost, can basically save you the effort of estimating against it at all if you determine it is poorly aligned. So let's look at some examples of how we can quantify some of these alignment aspects. Will the project create or a new or expanded relationship? Is this a project that has some aspect that you want to be known for doing work like this and you want to do more work like this? Conversely, is this the kind of project where it might pay the bills, but it's not necessarily a project that you want to attract more of in the future? Does it represent a personal learning or professional growth opportunity to learn something new or be paid to learn something new? Might it just simply have a high value like sonic branding? Might it just simply have a high profit margin or large monetary amount that might make it aligned because, frankly, you need work right now? Will it provide significant visibility or prestige for being associated with a project like that? Will it fill a gap in your billability? Or are you having a slow month and you really want to land that project? Therefore, it's super aligned. You can see how I said alignment is really based on your immediate circumstances, because what is an aligned project changes month to month, quarter to quarter, year to year. Will it land at a time that you're already slammed? And this is where maybe it's not aligned because it's okay dollar-wise, but it's it's work you've kind of done before but aren't super stoked on, and you're already kind of overwhelmed. Does the content just seem fun? Does the team seem fun? This is a really important aspect of alignment, given that we're all in a creative industry. And then is your contribution strategically valuable to the client? We addressed this a little bit earlier, talking about value-based pricing. If you're doing like hero elements for a game, creatures, weapons, sonic branding, main themes, stuff like that, that is absolutely materially higher value, strategically speaking, to a client. So if anyone like me consumed the Play, Watch, Listen podcast, you might have heard Austin Wintory talk about how his agent discusses alignment. And I wanted to share this with you because I think it's a really good way to kind of roll up a lot of these alignment factors. Austin's agent asks him, will this project feed my practice or my career? Will this project feed my wallet? Will this project feed my soul? Will it satisfy me personally and creatively? And this is a really good kind of shorthand to categorize elements of alignment, but you still need to quantify each specific point of alignment as you answer these questions. The most aligned project is where the answer to all three of these is yes, or to a great degree. A poorly aligned project is where all of these are, the answer to all of these is like, maybe not so much. When you present your price to the client, we're going to talk about this very briefly. You got to be dispassionate and honest. Just don't bring emotion into it. Practice presenting to a friendly person if that helps take the edge off, because these are just conversations that need to happen. Never over-explain your rationale to how you got to your price. If there are questions, the client will ask. And that's another great way to kind of stay dispassionate and say, my price is this, and here's why. Tell them what the price is. And if they ask for justification, you've got all your risk factors listed out. You've got all of your scope assumptions, inclusions and exclusions listed out. You've got huge amounts of ammo to justify your price. And if the price is deemed not acceptable, you can negotiate using those things that you've documented. So you got to be ready with all those specifics when it does come time to potentially negotiate or discuss why your price landed at a certain point. And finally, always frame these things as conversations and never ultimatums. Always say, like, let's have a conversation about how the price is starting to shake out. And it's just even using words like that can help it feel less solid and immovable and non-negotiable. So when I'm ready to present a price to a client, I usually send them an email and say, hey, I'm starting to really get a good sense of, I think I've got a good sense of the product. I've documented some assumptions on my part that I want to run by you, and I'd like to have a conversation about what the price is looking like. And then you can present your price, and it's in the context of a conversation, not a, this project will cost this much money. And so that I find is a good way to just kind of make it professional, but still collegial and not as threatening. And finally, remember, you can never, ever negotiate upwards from where you start. Just it's impossible. So to wrap, document everything. Yay, spreadsheets. This is how I document risk and alignment. And I've got a big pricing matrix. They're not hard to put together. It's just a bunch of formulas and a bunch of percentages and a whole bunch of free-form entry text fields for me to document how I'm thinking about all of these things. Determine what's negotiable versus what's not. Is your cost in any way negotiable because you can change something about your circumstances? If it's not negotiable. Focus on what can be, such as maybe the kinds of projects that you're looking at, the risk factors that maybe could be mitigated by some extra work on the client, stuff like that. And then always take the long view. One project is very rarely going to make or break your career. And because estimation is an art, not a science, we're always going to be getting these things more right or more wrong over our careers. So just take the long view that some projects are going to be operating at a lower margin than you want, some much higher. Learn why those differences happened, apply that to the next project, to the next project, to the next project, and let that profit margin hopefully always be there. But if it varies, that's okay. That's completely 100% normal. So with that, we have 20 minutes left for questions. So I hope that was interesting and informative. I'm going to hop back over to the chat window. And at this point, I would love to hear any questions or items for clarification anyone would like to bring up. I can be reached also through my socials. My DMs are open on all these platforms. And my URL where you can find information about me, my bio, and stuff like that is down there as well. Hey, appreciate all the kind words. Thank you. Cedric asks, is there an example of my spreadsheet? I'd have to think about that, Cedric, only because, again, all of these things are so personal. But I would definitely consider at some point, if there's a lot more demand for it, I could kind of sanitize it and clean it up a little bit and potentially send that out. So appreciate you asking. And if I get a lot more requests for that, I can certainly consider doing that. But honestly, I would just, to start, I would just have a spreadsheet with your cost, everything that goes into it. List out all of your expenditures and how much you need to save and stuff like that. And that'll come up with a cost per day or per week, however you choose to bill. And then basically have another section with risk factors with percentages, and have those just all apply to your cost, which of course you have to multiply your cost by the scope. If I'm going to charge a weekly rate, how many weeks am I going to be working? And then just have a bunch of percentages for risk and a bunch of percentages for alignment, and start iterating that way. So thank you for that question, Cedric. I saw that Almut had a question. Alma's question is, how long does it usually take you to look into, oh, everything keeps scrolling. Oh my goodness. How long does it take you, where the heck did your question go, Almut? It was a good one too. To look into all the points that you've mentioned and decide on a price, and how many meetings with the client does it take to assess scope and other factors? Great question. Thank you, Almut. So usually I have a introduction call with a client where they say, we would like you to work on this project. And I say, I believe this is aligned and I'm interested. Let's have a discussion about the broad strokes. So I take a bunch of notes. They then usually give me a written statement of work, which is a scope document, basically. And then I use that scope document to start documenting my price, or deriving my price. And then once that is derived, then I wind up having another conversation with them that is basically about three things. Number one, I say, I've read your scope document. I have made a bunch of assumptions I want to run by you, and I have some questions. There's always going to be questions on scope. And I would like to talk about how the price is shaking out as a result of that. So we have usually a phone call. We find that maybe 75% of my assumptions are correct, 25% are not. And that's going to affect both scope and risk and a whole bunch of things. And then I actually have my spreadsheet open in another tab, and I'm actually changing this stuff on the fly. So in the last few minutes of the phone call, I can say, oh, I think the price is going to land about here. And I give them a range, not a specific number. And so at that point, we say, how palatable is that? And then usually after that, it's just an email thread, kind of honing down what those agreements are. So I find that for kind of from the end of the business development process, well, the biz dev process usually goes from having a lead turn into an opportunity, turn into an actual job. So once the opportunity is vetted and aligned, turning that into a job usually takes anywhere between 1 and 3 phone calls, I find. So hopefully that answers your question, Almut. Let me see who else has questions here. Thank you all for hanging with me for the last hour. Let's see. Vincent asks a good question. How do you legalize the contract that you provide by your own to the client? So almost always when you're working with a development studio or a game studio of any size, usually all of the paperwork is in their language presented to you, usually. When I work with independents, that's not always the case. With indie developers, sometimes I have to use my own contract templates. I found contract templates online, modified them by myself, ran them by a lawyer, which then, of course, completely changed them for the better. And then that's, as a result, I now have my own kind of contract template. And usually what most larger companies do is you actually sign two pieces of paperwork as a freelancer. One is called an independent contractors agreement, or ICA. And this is just like, how are we going to work together in general? The how, where are we going to arbitrate if something goes wrong? What's the NDA situation? Blah, 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 blah. That's in an ICA, independent contractor agreement. The actual project is a statement of work, or SOW. So for most of my clients, for most of my larger clients, I have one ICA for the client, and then I have a statement of work for every project that we do. And so for when you run it by your own lawyer, it just depends on how long it'll take them to review it. Usually a day turnaround is about right. Corporate lawyers take longer just because they've got so much more on their plate. So the turnaround time on when you might get revisions back from a client is highly variable, and that's really hard to quantify. But that was a great question. Let's see. Hey, Jacob, thanks for catching the live I did with Vanessa and Krista. That was fun. Thanks for the shout out to those amazing folks. Let's see. Sorry, there's a lot of scrolling I have to do to read your questions. Okay, so Adam asked, can you provide a quick real-world example of the main equation you discussed, something similar to a recent project? Yeah, Adam, let me think about that. So this isn't recent, and this is actually even for another company before I started doing what I do now. But I do remember we had a client where we had direct access to the primary stakeholder, who is the person who would be making all the creative go, no go, yes, no decisions. So that was 0% risk because we knew who this person was. This person was our primary point of contact on the project. We'll talk about that in a second. So that sounded good, but there was no design brief. This person clearly needed help just ideating, much less the concrete deliverables. And so this person had no actual vision. They were the vision holder. They were holding no vision. And so that increased risk by, I think we applied it at 10%. And that was only because we knew they would need our help. And that help, that iteration cycle, that consultation, that's hard to put in a scope document and say, that's going to take so many hours or days. So we added 10% risk to the fact that the project itself was well scoped, but the vision of what success looked like was incredibly vague to non-existent. So that got 10, maybe even 12% from us. We also applied a risk factor to that project because our primary point of contact was the stakeholder. Why isn't that a good thing? Well, it's a high-level executive at the company. So how available is this person going to be to us for important things like managing the project, but then for all the little things like billing questions or trying to get meetings scheduled? So we added 10% risk just for how unavailable this person was probably going to be, and that wound up being 100% accurate and true. So much so that we basically a little bit into the project, we actually pulled the ripcord and we're like, we need to have like a come to Buddha discussion. And we're just like, well, you have to designate someone else on your team to be the primary point of contact, because this is just creating so much churn and we can never reach you with questions. So we did the project because it was incredibly aligned in a new industry vertical we had never worked in before. So we actually discounted the project by 10% because we wanted to have our agency have more highly visible experience in this industry vertical. It happened to be biomedical. So it was really aligned for us, opening up a new vertical for us. And so that's some stuff that comes to mind about one specific project. Hope that was helpful, Adam. I'm going to scroll back again. Greg, I think I answered the question about how long do contract negotiations usually take. The person, Greg asked, who is the person on the other end of the negotiation on the client side? That's almost always, in my experience, a producer. or a project manager or a product manager. That's not always true, though. Sometimes it's an audio director. Um, depends on the project. When I basically do a lot of mastering for ArenaNet of their soundtracks, both in game and for soundtrack releases. And my primary point of contact is the audio director, Drew. And he's got a producer named Cecil, where we kind of deal with like the tactical, contractual stuff. So it varies place to place. So Stephen Alvarez asked if there's any chance the slides will be shared via PDF. Yeah, possibly. The slides are technically going to be available for perpetuity on YouTube in this format, but I understand that a PDF would certainly be a lot easier to look at and parse and study. So thank you for that suggestion, Stephen. I don't know, but let me talk with the Aircon folks, and we'll see if we can get that posted somewhere. I'm also going to, if anyone needs me to pop the screen back on, I will, but I'll stop sharing, and so you can look at my disgusting mug instead of my boring slides. Let's see. Elmut has another great question. A scope document requires the client to know what they need, and I find that's not always the case with indies and or early in the project. What then? That's a great question. So this is where risk and alignment actually can be applied. So if the project if the project is really ill-defined, or it's really early in the process, and maybe that's great. Maybe they want to bring an audio person in while things are still being formed and the final outcome is just unknown. That's actually great. So that would make it a really aligned project. Sound being brought in early. Oh my God, that's awesome. But if what I would do is I would add risk to the project because the outcome isn't known. So what I would do is that risk then basically reflects me putting in extra time to help everybody define what the scope will be. And in that case, what I will do is I will actually split the project into separate, discretely contracted phases. So I might say, if you're bringing me in so early, maybe we're in pre-production, here's a bid for having me available for just a certain billable percentage of time for a few months in pre-production. And maybe here is a budget range for production and post. And basically the outcome of the pre-production phase will take that price range, and through the pre-production process slowly narrow that price range until at the end of pre-production, I know what the price is for production and post. Or I might even do separate contracts or separate statements of work for pre-production, production, and post-production, depending on how the studio defines it, or if it's a linear project versus a game project or whatever. So if things are really kind of squidgy and not knowable in terms of final scope on the actual like doing of the thing, split it up into separate contracted phases entirely. And that builds a long-term relationship. It allows you to build trust. The first part could just be like, you're basically renting my brain for 25% time for 3 months. And I'm just going to be here to help kind of define and scope. And this is a great way to do it also if you're a contracted, basically one person like audio department or audio director for an indie group, is just split it up into what is knowable and you can scope and say like, okay, well, based on the outcome of that, the outcome might be, N to 2 times N. And then every month or quarter, like go back to your spreadsheet and see if we can tighten that up a little bit based on what you're learning. So that would be my approach to a situation like that. Hope that helps. So Jason has a question I will read as soon as I take another drink of water. So Jason asks, if you're new to the industry and are starting at zero with a client base, what would you advise when approaching a possible lead? Would this come down to alignment and taking it on for free? Maybe is always my answer to questions like this. Maybe. And it depends on your circumstance. So I wound up switching careers full-time into audio, I don't know, 6-7 years ago. And because I was starting kind of fresh, I had a lot of relationships that I had built because I've been blogging about sound since 2009. So I had all these relationships, but I didn't have like a body of work yet. And so what I did is I found some of this is luck, frankly, and circumstance and just being fortunate. I found a mix of projects that fed my wallet and projects that fed my brain. So at the time, I'm like, is a project aligned with my soul, to use Austin's agents model? It didn't matter where I was at my career. Like I knew I was going to be doing, I probably had to take on projects that I wasn't just like heartfelt and loving, but I knew that I needed to find projects that would pay the mortgage, and I needed projects that would build my skills. And I found a mix of projects that I could do for, frankly, pretty relatively low pay compared to what I was used to. But I did a few projects for free just to learn on the job. And basically, sometimes if you provide someone a really low fee, I use the term honorarium. It's like, I just want to work on your project. Pay me a small honorarium, and I will give you about this much of my time. And that worked out great for a couple of indie game projects. So, so still approach all of these discussions as if you're going to give a real price. That price just might happen to be €0, or it might be $500. And because you never know the circumstances of the clients that are coming to you as well. It might be a single developer who just left a sweet gig somewhere, and they're sitting on a pretty big kind of self-assigned budget that they're willing to pay someone to help out, even if it's a single indie dev. Or it might be a single indie dev who's been working only on this project and then they have no budget. It could be anything in between. So I would strongly suggest, if you're early in your career, approach every project like you're going to be paid, always. And it's just up to you how much of an alignment-based discount you apply. And if you're going to go as low as, I'm going to discount the project by 100%, just have some really solid reasons for doing so that you can clearly articulate. And then once the project is over, here's an important thing about all of this stuff. Reflect back on that decision you made and try to figure out if that was a good decision or not. Because sometimes it pays off huge dividends. Sometimes it was a huge mistake. And that doesn't mean that the client screwed you. It meant that you just made a value call that wound up not panning out. That happens. You have to be gentle with yourself too, with this stuff, because we're not perfect. We're all humans and we make mistakes. And there's so little we know about a project when we first start learning about a project. It seems like sometimes, like after 2 phone calls, if the client says, "Yep, you're on board," you're like, "Oh, that was fast. Do I know everything about this project I need to know?" And that just happens. So, so yeah. So hopefully that answers your question. It's a nuanced one, as always, I'm afraid. Kingsley has a question. Red flags usually find from a client when negotiating for a gig, or any interesting story that really taught you about negotiating or handling clients. I've got a lot of examples coming to mind, Kingsley. I'm trying to think of the ones that I can actually share, if you understand me. Let's see. Yeah, I had a project where it was more of a kind of a technical red flag, which was I was going to be the only content creator and someone else, a developer, was going to be implementing all of my work. So that was a risk. That was a potential reputational risk. I didn't know the developer. I was dealing with the game's producer, and I had no idea how it was going to turn out. And I negotiated that, a certain number of weeks of the developer's time would have to be held at the end for like tweaking the mix based on my feedback. And that kind of happened, kind of didn't. So there was a reputational risk there of having my name associated with something where the implementation of my work wouldn't be at the right level for me to be comfortable having my name associated with it. So things like that are challenging. One phrase always a fan of, oh, it's 9:30. We're gonna call this pretty quick. Um, One thing that I think is important in all aspects of life, not just business development or work, is I think that all of life and all of relationships is 90% expectation management. So if you wind up having to um, negotiate or have these discussions that are a little bit maybe not fraught, but potentially kind of sensitive, um, just ask what people's expectations are for the outcome of this process. Um, I'll give you an example from the world of mastering. So I do a lot of soundtrack mastering. I do not usually have to ask the composer what their expectations are coming out of the mastering process. They've been through this before. So they're assuming everything will be balanced, some EQ. Certainly, they expect tasteful reduction of dynamic range, but tasteful varies if it's like an electronic score versus a full orchestral score. I do have to ask this question about expectations of what the outcome of the mastering process is with amateur musicians all the time, and that's fine. They shouldn't know. They have no basis for knowing necessarily. But I found that by asking some of those questions of certain kinds of clients, I can have them basically tell me that they expect something that mastering can't deliver. And that allows me to have a conversation with them about, like, that's actually not what mastering can do. Um, so maybe what we should do is kick your project out by a month and you work more on your mixes in this way and that way. Maybe you hire me for some mix reviews first instead of going right into mastering, and I can help use my ears to address some of the concerns and things that you want the mastering process to handle. So clarifying what those expectation managements are is really important. So unfortunately, we've run out of time, but guess what? I'm doing a day-long AMA tomorrow. So if you have questions I didn't get to in the chat, first of all, I'm really sorry. But you have an opportunity to ask me anything you want about this topic, business development, interactive audio. I did an AMA on mastering last week, but if you want to ask me questions about that too, I'm happy to field them. So don't feel like this is the last opportunity you have to ask questions. You can shoot them at me through the AMA. And of course, I put all my socials and stuff like that on the previous slide. So thank you all for taking the time and hanging out 2 minutes late. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day or evening. And I hope that was helpful to you. Thank you so much for joining us.